interesting thing when you start talking about religion and politics, because the question really is, where do you begin? And if you are a religious person, you probably begin with your theology. You think about, what do you believe? What does the Bible have to say about certain issues? And where are you going to start the discussion and the thinking about how you're going to vote, what candidates you're going to follow, what you really believe and what your values are. The tricky thing about religion, among many, many things, is that we can look at religion individually and we can look at it socially. So individually, we often think about religion in terms of our individual belief systems, our relationship with God, what are our spiritual practices, and those can be anything from the meditation and the readings you do and how you nurture your spiritual life, what kind of prayers you do, what churches you go to, and what kind of books you read. Are you reading Billy Graham, or are you reading Kathleen Norris, or who are you reading and how are those affecting you? So there's this whole individual side of religion. Then there's the social side, and we usually think of this as the social gospel. I think Glenn Beck said, don't ever allow anyone in any room to ever use that word social gospel. It's just awful. But basically the idea of social gospel is that religion is also social, that our calling is not just for our individual relationship with God, but that our calling is also in terms of how we look at society and what we do with society. So sometimes what happens is candidates begin, they kind of look at the Bible and they decide which is their issue they're going to follow. So as Bill said about Lieberman, is that it's protect Israel. They can look at the Hebrew scriptures and say there's a whole lot about the Jews as the chosen people and the importance of protecting Israel, so that everything is going to flow from that. That's going to be the absolutely important thing. Some people start and say, well, the United States is a Christian nation, and above all things, we have got to preserve the Judeo-Christian heritage. James Dobson, I don't know if any of you got the phone call, but James Dobson is calling all ministers in the city with a message about that this is what is most important. And they got us a little confused being Quakers, and I don't think they were sure who to call, but one of our members did get the phone call and forwarded it to me so I could hear what James Dobson had to say, so that's where he starts. But biblically, one of the places I always think one needs to start when you're thinking socially and politically is with the mission statement of Jesus. That is, if you're going to come from a Christian perspective. That the very first thing Jesus did when he started his mission is he went in the temple, he opened up the book, and he said, I came in order to bring release for the captives, recovery of sight for the blind, to set at liberty all those who are oppressed. And say that's a pretty straight statement, because what Jesus was saying is that I side with the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted and the disenfranchised and the uncared for. If you say, where did Jesus side? Who did he side with? It was always with them. It was not with the establishment. It was not with the rich. So what's interesting about this is that there are about 2,000 verses in the Bible that deal with the poor, the needy, the oppressed, the widows, and the orphans. And I mean, that's pretty substantial, especially when you compare that with what some religious people take as their mission statement. There are no verses in the Bible about abortion. There are some verses that, with some tweaking of them, one can talk about the sanctity of life, but there is really nothing about abortion. The only verse I know of in the Bible that in any way relates to it seems to be pro-abortion. Actually, it is. It's Numbers 5:12, and it's a story about a woman who is taken in adultery, and they basically say, well, if she's guilty, we're going to have her drink this bitter herb, and if she's guilty, her organs will shrivel up, which means killing the fetus, And if she's not guilty, then they won't, and then she can go on and bear children. It's a very interesting verse. So there's really hardly anything in there. You really have to kind of tweak it a lot to get that. There are about 5 to 7 verses in the Bible about homosexuality. And in those verses, there's some real question about exactly what they're talking about. Because there's a lot of research that says what these verses are talking about is degrading sexual practices, like older men with a lot of power with boys and with younger men, and an uneven and unequal power arrangement. So you maybe can get it down to 2 or 3 that are part of holiness codes, which basically also say don't carry wood on the Sabbath and women don't have short hair. So, you know, we can say, well, we don't follow most of them. So there's a sort of questionable about exactly what's going on in those few. But if you compare that to this idea of around 2,000 verses about the poor and the oppressed, and then there are about 500 verses that have to do with nations. Nations called to account, not just individuals, but nations, and the idea of the importance of justice and mercy. And I just want to read you one of those hundreds from Isaiah 10, because it just seems so specific. It says, "Woe to those who enact unjust decrees, who compose oppressive legislation to deny justice to the weak, and to cheat the humblest of my people of fair judgment, to make widows their prey, and to rob the orphan." So if one took this idea and said, you know, I start where the whole Bible seems to have this umbrella or this over idea and concept of what we might call solidarity with the oppressed and the poor. And if you start with that, you begin to think about any legislation. What is the legislation that confronts sexism, racism, ageism, classism? And how does it confront it? Does it help it? That is, does it help the oppressed? When you read a bill, for instance, that said there's a lot of poor children who are not getting enough to eat, I would consider those children oppressed, that they are the outcast of society. So that there seems to be an overall religious idea of equalizing power. There was also this idea of what we might call solidarity. Where do we put our solidarity? Do we coddle the rich, or do we care for the poor? Where do we really stand on this? One of the great theologians, Protestant theologians of the 20th century is Karl Barth. And what he says about Christian community is, he said, it explicitly accepts solidarity with the least of the little ones. So when Jesus says, even as you have done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me, that the idea that's where we stand. So he says, those who are in obscurity and not seen, the people who are pushed to the margin, the outer margin of the life of human society, those people who seem to be useless and insignificant and burdensome, quite different than the CEOs of Wall Street, and therefore the hungry, thirsty, naked, homeless, sick, and imprisoned man. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a handout. It just means that you start there in forming that this is a good starting place, and I think this is usually the liberal starting place.